When my brother warned me not to touch our late mother's storage boxes, I thought it was just his usual control issue. But one night, the silence of the old house felt too heavy, so I opened one. I wasn't looking for memories, but I found proof instead. Proof that my golden brother, the family's pride, had built his entire perfect life, and systematically dismantled mine on a foundation of devastating lies. My name is Claire Monroe. I am 33 years old, and for the last decade, my life has been a quiet exercise in order and predictability. As an accountant for a small real estate firm in a sleepy corner of Pennsylvania, I spend my days reconciling numbers, balancing ledgers, and ensuring that every decimal point aligns perfectly. My world is one of clean lines, logical progressions, and verifiable facts. It's a world I built for myself, a fortress of spreadsheets and certainties, far from the emotional complexities of the house I grew up in. But after our mother's death, the fortress crumbled. I had to go back. The house hadn't changed, which somehow made the grief worse. It stood on a half-acre of overgrown lawn, a two-story colonial that had settled into its foundation with a weary sigh years ago. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lemon polish, old paper, and the faint, lingering aroma of Mom's lavender soap. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light that cut through the drawn curtains, illuminating a landscape of my childhood. Every scuff on the hardwood floor, every chipped teacup on the mantel, every faded photograph in its silver frame was a ghost. Moving back into sort through the estate with my older brother, Dylan, felt less like a homecoming and more like an excavation of a life that was no longer there. The silence was the loudest thing in the house. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on me, a constant reminder of the voice that was missing. From the very first day, Dylan established the rules. He had always been the one in charge, the golden boy, the one who made decisions with an easy confidence that I could never muster. Grief hadn't changed that, it had amplified it. He strode through the house with a grim purpose, his jaw set, his shoulders squared as if carrying the burden for both of us. His primary rule concerned our mother's bedroom. "Don't touch Mom's room, Claire," he said, his voice low but firm, the words leaving no room for argument. We were standing in the dim hallway outside her door. "It's too much for you. I'll handle it." I didn't argue. In the raw, disorienting days after the funeral, I was grateful to be told what to do. The thought of opening that door, of facing the sanctuary where she spent her final years, was paralyzing. So I nodded, retreating into the familiar role of the compliant younger sister. I focused on the kitchen, the living room, the linen closet safe, impersonal spaces. I packed away knickknacks and sorted through junk mail, leaving the heart of the house and the heart of our shared past untouched. The same rule applied to the storage shed out back. It was a small, weathered structure with peeling white paint and a heavy, rust-pocked padlock on the door. That shed was my mother's archive. It held everything she couldn't bear to part with, boxes of our school projects, photo albums dating back to her own childhood, holiday decorations, my father's old tools, and countless containers simply labeled memories. Dylan held the only key. He'd found it on her keyring and had clipped it to his own, a small silver token of his self-appointed authority. "I'll sort through the shed myself," he declared. "No need for you to worry about it." And I, lost in my fog of sorrow, had simply agreed. But as days bled into weeks, a strange pattern began to emerge, a subtle disruption in the quiet rhythm of our mornings. Dylan's visits to the house became nocturnal and solitary. He'd call me in the afternoon, his voice a mask of cheerful concern. "How are you holding up, Claire? Need anything from town?" But he never came over during the day. Instead, I'd be woken late at night, long after the suburban street had fallen silent, by the distant crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I'd lie perfectly still in my childhood bed, the floral wallpaper seeming to close in on me, and listen. The sound of his truck door opening and closing was muffled, secretive, then silence. I would strain to hear footsteps on the porch, or the turn of a key in the lock, but there was nothing. He never came inside the house. He was only there for the shed. An hour, sometimes two, would pass in tense silence, and then I'd hear the truck start again, its engine a low rumble that faded into the night. By the time I came downstairs in the morning, there would be no sign he had ever been there. The secrecy of it began to unnerve me. Why did he only come at night? What was he doing in that shed, alone in the dark? Was he simply grieving in his own private way? Sifting through memories under the cloak of darkness, where no one could see his pain. I tried to believe that. I wanted to believe that Dylan had always been the strong one, the one who never cried, not even at the funeral. Perhaps this was his way of letting go. But the explanation felt thin, a flimsy excuse that didn't quite cover the sharp edges of my growing suspicion. The late-night visits felt less like mourning and more like a clandestine operation. Then came the evening that changed everything. I was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of chamomile tea, when the familiar sound of his Ford F-150 pulled into the drive. This time, however, it was earlier than usual, just after dusk had settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. I watched from the window as the truck's headlights cut a swath across the overgrown lawn, illuminating the front of the shed. He got out and went to the back of the truck, lowering the tailgate with a metallic clang that echoed in the quiet air. He wasn't just sorting, he was removing things. He hauled out 2 large cardboard boxes sealed with thick tape. He carried them with a strange urgency, his movements quick and efficient. I crept to the back door, my heart starting to thrum a nervous rhythm against my ribs. Pushing the screen door open just a crack, I saw the stark black letters scrolled across the side of each box in marker, trash. My mother had never thrown anything away. She saw history and value in everything, from a chipped teacup to a faded receipt. The idea that anything from her collection of memories could be labeled as trash felt like a desecration. He went back to the truck for a third, then a fourth box, all marked with the same brutal word. I couldn't stay silent. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on my arms. "Dylan," I called, my voice quieter than I intended. He froze, his back to me. He straightened up slowly, turning with a reluctance that was palpable. His face, caught in the yellow glow of the porch light, was a mask of strained composure. "Claire, you're still up. What are you doing?" I nodded toward the boxes stacked near the shed. "What are you throwing out?" He avoided my gaze, looking off toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the property. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Memories," he said. "It's just old stuff, junk. It's better this way. Just let me handle it." "But it's Mom's," I protested, taking a step forward. "Shouldn't we go through it together? There might be things." "There's nothing," he cut in, his tone sharp enough to make me flinch. "It's just junk. Tax records from 20 years ago. Old magazines, broken appliances. It has to go now. Please go back inside. It's cold out here." He turned his back on me, dismissing me as if I were a child. He picked up another box, his movements deliberate and final. I stood there on the porch, wrapped in a sudden, chilling certainty. Something was wrong. Very wrong. This wasn't about cleaning out junk. His defensiveness, his secrecy, the brutal finality of the word trash, it was all a lie. He was hiding something. I retreated inside, but I didn't stop watching. I stood in the darkened kitchen, peering through the window, as he loaded a total of 7 boxes into the bed of his truck. He worked quickly, methodically, never once looking back toward the house before he left. He went to the shed, and I saw the distinct click and glint of the padlock snapping shut. He was locking it up again, securing his secret. A new kind of resolve began to form within me, cold and hard as steel. My grief was momentarily eclipsed by a sharp, analytical focus, the accountant in me taking over. I needed data. I needed proof. Before going to bed, I crept back outside. The air was cold, and the grass was damp with dew. I walked over to the spot where he had stacked the boxes. There was still more inside the shed. I was sure of it. I couldn't get in, but I could do the next best thing. I made a mental inventory of what I could see through the shed's grimy window: stacks of brown cardboard boxes, plastic storage totes, old furniture draped in white sheets. I counted the boxes that were clearly visible from the window. 17. The next morning, the first thing I did was go back to the shed. I peered through the window, my breath fogging the glass. My blood ran cold. I counted again, and then a third time to be sure. There were only 14 boxes visible. 3 more were gone. He had come back after I had gone to sleep. He had come back to take more. The lie was no longer just a feeling, it was a quantifiable fact. 7 boxes taken last night, and now 3 more missing. 10 boxes of our mother's life, labeled as trash, and spirited away in the dead of night by her own son. For 2 more days, I said nothing. I went about the quiet work of packing up the house, a cold fury simmering just beneath my calm exterior. And for 2 more nights, I lay awake and listened. On the second night, he didn't come. The silence was almost as unnerving as his presence. But on the third night, I heard it again. The crunch of gravel, the soft thud of the truck door. I didn't get up to watch this time. I already knew what he was doing. Lying there in the dark, I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was an auditor who had discovered a profound discrepancy. And I knew I could no longer stand by while my brother systematically erased our mother's past. His warning, "Don't touch her stuff," echoed in my mind. But it was no longer a protective suggestion, it was a threat. He wasn't protecting me from the pain of memory, he was protecting his own secrets. That was the moment I made my decision. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. He was a master of deflection and confident lies. I needed more than just a missing box count. I needed to see what was in those boxes he was so desperate to destroy. I needed to get inside that shed. I slipped out of bed, my movements silent and deliberate. Dylan had the key, but my mother had been a cautious woman. She believed in contingencies, in backups. There was always a spare. I just had to find it. My search began in the one place Dylan would never think to look, inside the dusty, forgotten recipe box on top of the refrigerator. It was time to find out what memories my brother was so afraid of. The old recipe box was coated in a fine layer of dust and grease, a forgotten relic on top of the refrigerator. My mother hadn't used it in years, preferring the convenience of recipes saved on her tablet, but she never threw it away. It was a piece of her own mother's kitchen, a tangible link to the past. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the wooden lid. Inside, the scent of vanilla and old paper wafted out. The recipe cards were yellowed and soft at the edges, stained with fingerprints of flour and butter from decades of use. I sifted through them, past handwritten instructions for pot roast and apple pie, until my fingers brushed against something hard and metallic at the bottom. Tucked beneath a card for Nana's Christmas cookies was a small, tarnished brass key, a spare. I knew instantly it was for the shed. Mom always said every important lock should have a secret backup. I closed my hand around it, the cold metal a small, solid piece of certainty in a world that was rapidly dissolving into chaos. Clutching the key, I slipped out the back door and into the damp, silent night. As I crossed the lawn, the looming silhouette of the shed seemed menacing. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the man I was investigating with the brother the world knew. To everyone else, Dylan Monroe was the personification of success. He was a senior financial manager at a respected firm downtown, a man who handled multi-million-dollar accounts with an air of unflappable competence. He was a model citizen, a member of the local Chamber of Commerce, a coach for his son's Little League team. His family life was a picture postcard of suburban perfection, a beautiful wife, 2 bright, happy children, a pristine home in the newest development on the other side of town. Their annual Christmas card was a masterclass in curated joy, the 4 of them in matching sweaters, smiling flawlessly for the camera. Dylan was the golden boy, the rock, the one who had his life completely and utterly together. He was the son our mother had always bragged about. He had always tried to manage my life, too, but I'd mistaken it for care. His control was a quiet, insidious thing, always cloaked in the guise of brotherly concern. It was most evident when it came to my finances. How much are you putting into your 401k? Claire, he'd ask over holiday dinners. You should be more aggressive with your investments. Let me take a look at your portfolio. When I bought my modest condo a few years back, he'd insisted on reviewing all the paperwork, tutting under his breath about the interest rate I'd secured. You should have let me handle this, he'd said, shaking his head. I could have gotten you a much better deal. His questions were relentless. Did you pay off your credit card this month? You know the interest on that thing is criminal. How much did you spend on that vacation? You need to be building a nest egg, not squandering your savings. I'd always brushed it off. He was a financial manager, after all. Numbers were his language. I thought he was just trying to protect his scatterbrained little sister, the one who worked with numbers, but lacked his grand strategic vision. I saw his questions as a slightly overbearing form of love. That illusion began to crack a month before our mother's death. It started with a single piece of mail. I was sifting through the usual pile of bills and junk circulars when I saw a crisp white envelope from Keystone Mutual Bank. I didn't have an account with Keystone, thinking it was just another credit card offer. I almost tossed it in the recycling bin, but something made me pause. It wasn't addressed to resident, but to me by name, Claire Monroe. I slid it open with a sense of mild curiosity. Inside was not an offer, but a statement. A loan statement. The document was cold and impersonal. It detailed a personal loan taken out 6 months prior for a staggering sum of money. My eyes scanned the numbers, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The loan was for $240,000. My name was at the top of the statement. My address printed correctly beneath it. A wave of nausea washed over me. This had to be a mistake, a clerical error, or worse, identity theft. My first instinct was to call the bank, to report the fraud. I spent a week on the phone navigating automated menus and being transferred from one department to another, my frustration mounting with each call. Finally, I was put through to a loan officer, who agreed to mail me a copy of the original loan application. We'll need to verify the signature. He'd said in a bored, monotonous voice. When the application arrived, the nausea returned with a vengeance. I spread the papers out on my kitchen table, my hands shaking, and there it was on the final page, scrolled above the printed line, my signature. Except it wasn't. It was a forgery. But it was a masterful one. I stared at it, my accountant's eye for detail kicking into overdrive, the fluid loop of the C, the sharp upward tick of the final E in Monroe. It was perfect. It was my signature, exactly as I would have written it. I grabbed a pen and a blank sheet of paper, and signed my name. Again and again, I laid my real signatures next to the one on the document. They were identical. Whoever did this didn't just copy my name, they had studied it. Practiced it, inhabited it. The violation of it was profound. It felt like someone had stolen a piece of my very identity. A cold dread seeped into my bones as a memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharpening into horrifying focus. It was from last year. Mom had just had a fall, and we were navigating the labyrinthine world of her long-term care insurance. Dylan had come over, his face etched with worry, carrying a thick binder of paperwork. He'd seemed overwhelmed, the devoted son trying to manage a crisis. "This is a nightmare, Claire," he'd sighed, rubbing his temples. "The insurance company needs a ton of information, copies of everything. They need our IDs on file as her legal next of kin and beneficiaries." He had looked at me, his eyes full of exhaustion. "Can I borrow your driver's license? I just need to make a copy for the file. It'll save me a trip back here tomorrow." Of course, I'd said yes. He was my brother. He was handling everything. I'd given him my license without a second thought, and he'd returned it an hour later with a grateful smile. "Thanks, Claire. You're a lifesaver." Now, standing in the dark, clutching the cold brass key to the shed, that memory felt toxic. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. The dots began to connect in my mind with a terrifying logical precision. The secret late-night trips to the shed. The boxes of our mother's life hastily labeled trash. The constant probing questions about my finances. The perfectly forged signature on a loan I never knew existed. It wasn't just about getting rid of old, painful memories. He was covering his tracks. My brother, the perfect son, the pillar of the community, had stolen my name, my signature, my financial security. He was hiding a secret, and I was sure the proof was locked inside this shed. My hands were surprisingly steady as I inserted the key into the padlock. It resisted at first, stiff from years of disuse. I jiggled it, pushing harder, until I felt the internal tumblers give way with a satisfying click. The lock sprang open. I slid the heavy bolt back, and pulled the creaking wooden door open. A wave of musty air, thick with the smell of mildew and dust, washed over me. I fumbled for the light switch just inside the door, and a single bare bulb flickered on, casting a weak yellow light over a chaotic jumble of a life packed away. Boxes were stacked precariously to the ceiling. Old furniture was draped in ghostly white sheets. It was exactly as I had seen it through the window, but now it was real, tangible. I didn't know where to begin. My eyes scanned the labels on the boxes, Christmas ornaments, Claire's schoolwork, old photos. My gaze landed on one of the boxes he had intended to throw away. It was one of the few without a label, sealed with heavy-duty packing tape. I used the edge of the key to slice through the tape and folded back the cardboard flaps. My heart pounded. This was it. This would hold the answers. Inside, I found nothing. Nothing but old clothes, sweaters eaten by moths, faded blouses, a pile of my mother's old winter coats. A wave of disappointment and confusion washed over me. Was I wrong? Had I constructed this elaborate conspiracy in my head out of grief and suspicion? I felt like a fool. I started to close the box, but something stopped me. An instinct. I reached back in and picked up my mother's old whoopee coat. It was heavy, familiar. I used to bury my face in it as a child when she hugged me. My hand went automatically to the pockets. In the right one, my fingers closed around a small, hard rectangular object. I pulled it out and held it under the dim light. It was a USB flash drive, a simple silver drive, the kind you could buy anywhere, but there was a small white label affixed to it, the kind used for pricing garage sale items. On the label, in my mother's shaky, but unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words that made the air leave my lungs, "For Claire, if he lies." Back in the house, the silence was different. It was no longer the empty, mournful silence of grief. It was the charged, humming silence of a crime scene. I locked the back door, my movements jerky and robotic. The small silver USB drive felt impossibly heavy in my palm, a dense little nugget of truth. I walked through the familiar rooms, but saw them with new eyes. The comfortable armchair, where my mother used to read, was now the place where a woman was held captive by fear. The polished dining table where we'd had countless family meals was a place where lies were served up with practiced smiles. I went to my temporary bedroom and sat at the small desk, my laptop open and waiting. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I slid the USB into the port. The click it made was sharp, definitive. A window popped up on the screen showing the drive's contents. It was starkly, terrifyingly simple. There were no vacation photos, no music files, no digital clutter. There was just one folder, a single solitary folder named Mortgage. My breath hitched. My mouse hovered over it for a second that stretched into an eternity. Then, with a final, decisive click, I opened it. Inside was a neat, orderly list of files. Most were PDFs with cold, clinical names, PA Margaret Monroe.pdf. Deed Transfer 94872. PDF. Kilometer Loan Agreement CM.pdf. There were also several image files named with strings of numbers. And then there was one audio file, an MP3. Its name was not clinical, its name was a message for Claire. MP3. I had to hear her voice before I could process the contracts and statements. My accountant's mind was already trying to deconstruct. I needed to hear her. I put on my headphones, as if to keep her words private, a secret between the two of us. I double-clicked the file. For a few seconds, there was only static, a soft hiss that sounded like a held breath. And then she spoke. Her voice was a ghost. It was thin, reedy, and laced with a weariness that went bone deep. It was the voice from her last few weeks in the hospital, strained and fragile. But it was hers. Claire, she began, her voice cracking on my name. Oh, my sweet girl, if you're listening to this, it means I'm gone, and it means your brother, it means Dylan has done what I was so afraid of. A sob caught in my throat. I pressed a hand to my mouth, stifling the sound. In the background of the recording, I could hear the faint, rhythmic beep of a hospital monitor, a steady punctuation to her pained, hesitant words. He's been unwell, she continued. And the euphemism was so typical of her, always trying to smooth over the ugly parts of life. Not in his mind, but in his spirit. After your father passed, something in him got hungry. He started making bad decisions with his business. I overheard him on the phone. He was in terrible debt. I offered to help, to sell the house and downsize, but he refused. His pride wouldn't allow it. She paused, and I heard the rustle of bedsheets. I could picture her perfectly, lying in that sterile white room, gathering her strength. About a year ago, after my first hospital stay, he came to me with some papers. He said they were just to allow him to pay my bills, to talk to the doctors for me. A power of attorney, he called it. I was so tired, Claire. The medication they had me on. I was so confused. He put a pen in my hand and showed me where to sign. I trusted him. He's my son. The last 3 words were heavy with a grief that dwarfed my own. I didn't think about it again until a letter came. It was from the county records office. It was a confirmation that the deed for this house, for our home, had been transferred. It was in his name now, sole ownership. He had used that power of attorney to steal our home from under me, from under us. I ripped the headphones from my ears, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The room was tilting, the floral wallpaper swimming before my eyes. He had stolen our house, the home my parents had worked their entire lives for. The only home I had ever known. The weight of his betrayal was a physical thing, crushing the air from my lungs. But I had to know the rest. I forced myself to put the headphones back on to listen to the rest of her testimony. And that's not all, her voice whispered, now barely audible. It's worse. I found some of his mail that had been sent here by mistake. Statements from that bank, Keystone Mutual. He tried to hide them, but he was sloppy. I saw the documents. Claire, a loan, a huge loan, and he had used you. The beeping of the monitor on the recording seemed to grow louder, faster, mirroring my own frantic pulse. He used your name, your good credit. He took out a loan for $240,000 and secured it with the house. The house he now owned. Our home is the collateral for a debt he put in your name. My own loan. The fraudulent statement. It wasn't random identity theft. It was him. It had been him all along. I confronted him, my mother's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and fury. I told him I would call you, that I would tell you everything. And he looked at me, Claire. His eyes were so cold. There was no love in them. He told me that if I said a word, he would have me committed. He said he would tell the doctors that my mind was failing, that I was having paranoid delusions. He said, your memory isn't what it used to be, Mom. The doctors are already concerned. It would be so easy to get you the help you need. He threatened to put me in a psychiatric hospital, to take away my freedom, to make sure no one would ever believe me. He would have painted me as a crazy old woman, and I was so scared. So I stayed quiet, and the silence has been eating me alive. The recording was filled with the sound of her weeping, a broken, desperate sound that shattered what was left of my heart. I was crying with her, hot, silent tears streaming down my face for the terror she had endured alone, for the son, who had become a monster, for the brother I had lost and never truly known. Finally, her crying subsided, replaced by a ragged breath. So, I made this recording, and I gathered the proof. It's all on this drive. I hid it where I knew only you would look. He thinks he's so clever, but he never understood the simple things, the sentimental things. A long pause. He used your name to get the money, Claire. He used your identity to wash his debts clean, and he left you with the stain. I'm so sorry. I was so weak. I sat there for a long time after the recording ended, the rhythmic beep of the hospital monitor echoing in the profound silence of my headphones. Then, with a cold, methodical calm that frightened me, I turned back to the other files. The emotional shock receded, replaced by the accountant's need for verification. I opened them one by one. POA Margaret Monroe.pdf. The power of attorney document. There was my mother's signature at the bottom. Weak and spidery, a pale imitation of her usually confident script. It was dated the day after she had been admitted to the hospital. Deed transfer 94872. PDF. The official county record. It showed the ownership of the property at 128, Maple Lane being transferred from Margaret Monroe to Dylan Monroe. The transfer was authorized by my mother's signature, but it wasn't her signature. It was a crisp, perfect signature executed by Dylan, acting as her power of attorney. Kilometer Loan Agreement CM.pdf. The loan from Keystone Mutual. $240,000. And there on the last page was the expert forgery of my signature. Finally, I clicked on the image files. They were cell phone pictures, slightly blurry, but perfectly legible. They were copies of wire transfer receipts. The funds from the Keystone Mutual loan had been dispersed in 3 large transfers. They had not been transferred to my bank account. They had been wired directly to a corporate account for a company named Dylan Monroe Associates, his shell corporation, the one he used for his private consulting, the one that kept his personal finances separate from the firm where he worked. The full, monstrous picture snapped into focus. It was a brilliantly simple, devastatingly cruel plan. He was drowning in debt. So he coerced our sick mother into signing over power of attorney. He used that to steal her only asset, the house. Then he used my identity and clean credit, backed by his new asset, the house, to secure a massive loan. He funneled the money into his private company, cleaning his debts. And I, Claire Monroe, was left on the hook for $250,000 I had never seen, secured by a house that was no longer in my family. He was going to let me default. Let my life be ruined. While he walked away with everything. My hand moved to the mouse, and I played the audio file one last time, skipping to the very end. Her voice, a mere whisper now, filled my ears. A final, ghostly warning from beyond the grave. He is a liar. Claire, whatever you do, don't trust his smile. My girl, the recording ended. I took off the headphones and sat in the silent room, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my tear-streaked face. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. In their place was something cold, something hard, something as precise and unforgiving as a balanced ledger. He hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen my mother's final days of peace. And for that, there had to be a reckoning. The first instinct, the primal one, was to burn it all down. To take the USB drive, walk into the nearest police station, and let the entire world see my brother for the monster he was. For a white-hot moment, I savored the fantasy, the shock on the detective's face, the flashing lights outside Dylan's perfect suburban home, the satisfying click of handcuffs on his wrists. But as the sun began to cast a pale grey light into the room, the accountant in me reasserted control. The cold, dispassionate logic that governed my professional life washed over the inferno of my rage, dousing the flames. I couldn't go to the police. Not yet. I spread the evidence out in my mind like a complex balance sheet. On one side, I had a coerced power of attorney, a forged signature on a loan document, and a posthumous recording of my mother's voice. It felt like a mountain of proof. But on the other side was Dylan. My brother wasn't just a thief. He was a master of his craft. He was a senior financial manager, a man who exuded charisma and competence. He could manipulate numbers, people, and narratives with equal skill. He would stand before any authority figure dressed in his tailored suit, his expression a perfect blend of sorrow and concern, and he would dismantle my story piece by piece. He would paint me as the grieving, unstable sister, overwhelmed by our mother's death, misinterpreting her confused ramblings. He would claim the power of attorney was to protect her assets. He would suggest the loan was a complex financial strategy we had concocted together, a strategy my grief-addled mind had forgotten. He would have expert testimony to question the recording's authenticity. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress of credibility. My word against his would be a siege, not a victory. To win, I couldn't just present evidence. I had to utterly demolish his fortress first. I needed an airtight, undeniable case built not on emotion, but on the one language he truly respected, numbers. This was a financial crime, and it would be unraveled by a financial professional. The victim was gone. The auditor had taken her place. The next morning, I went to work. The familiar routine of my commute, the mediocre coffee from the break room, the quiet hum of computers, it was all an anchor in the storm of my new reality. I sat at my desk, surrounded by the comforting order of spreadsheets and ledgers. This was my domain here. I wasn't the fragile little sister. I was Claire Monroe, the accountant who could spot a misplaced decimal from a mile away. And I was going to use every tool at my disposal. Our small firm occasionally used outside consultants for larger commercial real estate deals. Dylan's much larger firm had been one of them in the past. An idea, cold and sharp, began to form. I opened our company's internal accounts payable portal. My fingers moving with a new, illicit purpose. This was a breach of protocol, but morality was a luxury I could no longer afford. I typed Dylan Monroe Associates into the vendor search bar. No results. Of course, that was the company he'd funneled the loan money into. It was his known entity. He wouldn't be that sloppy. He would have another layer of separation, a corporate firewall. I changed my tactics. Instead of searching for his name, I started combing through the commission payment records from the last 2 years. I was looking for anomalies, for third-party brokerage firms or consultants I didn't recognize, especially on deals I knew his firm had been involved with. It took hours. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, scanning endless lines of data. And then I found it. A series of substantial commission payments made out to a company named Monroe Financial Solutions. It was too close to his name to be a coincidence. It was arrogant. I clicked on the vendor details. The company was registered to a P.O. box, a classic move to obscure a physical location. I ran a quick search on the state's business registry. Monroe Financial Solutions had been incorporated 18 months ago, right around the time my mother's health had taken its first serious downturn. This was it. This was his professional backdoor, the channel he used to skim money, clean and untraceable. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I created a new encrypted folder on an external hard drive. Systematically, I began to download every invoice, every payment authorization, every transaction record connected to Monroe Financial Solutions. The data flowed from my company's server onto my drive, a silent digital confession. That night, I turned my mother's dining room table into my war room. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened a new spreadsheet. This was where I was most powerful. The numbers didn't lie. The numbers didn't have a charming smile or a plausible excuse. I began to build a map of my brother's secret financial life. I created columns for dates, sources, amounts, and destinations. The commissions from my firm flowed in, thousands of dollars at a time. Then I integrated the data from my mother's USB. The 3 wire transfers from the Keystone Mutual loan, the money he stole in my name, appeared on the spreadsheet. A massive injection of capital into his shadow economy. I could see all the money pooling into one central business account. Now I needed to follow it out. I began to trace the debits. There were transfers to his personal accounts, masking the stolen funds as legitimate income. There were payments to high-end credit cards, funding the perfect life he presented to the world. And then I saw something that made me stop. It was a series of recurring monthly payments, all for the same odd amount, $189.99. The transaction description was cryptic. Just an alphanumeric code and the payee name, Carmel Store, PA Carmel Storage, Pennsylvania. The breath caught in my throat. A storage facility. The boxes. The boxes marked trash that he had hauled away in the dead of night. He hadn't destroyed them. He was a meticulous man, a man who understood the importance of documentation. He wouldn't have destroyed the records of his crime. He would have archived them, just like he archived everything else. He had rented a storage unit to hide the physical evidence. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it left me dizzy. He was using the money he'd stolen from our family to pay for the hiding place for the proof of his crimes. The next day was a blur. I called in sick to work and drove to the address I found for Carmel Storage. It was a sprawling, anonymous complex on the industrial outskirts of town, a place of transient lives and forgotten things. I walked into the office, my purse clutched in my hand, and put on the best performance of my life. I was a young professional, flustered and apologetic, needing a unit to store some furniture while my condo was being renovated. The manager, a beefy man with a bored expression, recited prices and sizes. Could I maybe see a 10 by 10 unit? I asked, injecting a note of cheerful helplessness into my voice. I'm terrible at visualizing space, he sighed, the sound of a man deeply inconvenienced, and grabbed a key card. Follow me. He led me down a long, echoing hallway of bright orange roll-up doors. My eyes darted from one number to the next, my heart pounding. 15, 16. There's Unit 17. And next to the hasp for the lock was a small plastic label holder. On the slip of paper inside, written in Dylan's neat block handwriting, was a single word, Corel. He had used the name of the facility itself as his alias. It was so brazen, it was almost brilliant. I thanked the manager, told him I'd think about it, and walked back to my car. But I didn't leave. I drove to a spot across the street with a clear view of the entrance, and I waited. At noon, the manager left for lunch, and a younger kid took his place behind the desk, immediately burying his face in his phone. This was my chance. I slipped out of my car and walked calmly back toward the facility. The main gate was still slowly closing. I slipped through the gap just before it shut. I walked directly to Unit 17. The lock was a heavy-duty brass padlock. For a horrifying moment, I thought my plan would end here. But then I remembered the spare key from my mother's recipe box. The key to her shed. I looked closer at the lock on the storage unit. It was the same brand, the same model as the one from the shed. My brother, a man of habit and cheap efficiency, had bought the same generic hardware store padlock for both. It was an almost laughable oversight. My hand trembled as I slid the old brass key into the lock. It fit. I turned it with a soft, metallic click. That was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The lock sprang open. I took a deep breath and slid the corrugated metal door upward. It rattled loudly in the silent hall. The smell hit me first, the familiar, dusty scent of my mother's house, of old paper and cedar. And there they were, the cardboard boxes. Some were labeled trash, just as I remembered. Others were labeled with my mother's neat cursive, financials. Documents, Claire. He hadn't just stored the boxes he'd taken that night. He had emptied the entire shed. I didn't have much time. I reached for the box labeled Claire. I sliced it open with my car key. It wasn't full of my old school projects. It was full of files. I pulled one out. It was a credit file. My credit file. It contained copies of my birth certificate, my social security card, everything he would have needed. He hadn't just borrowed my ID that day, he had copied my entire life. I opened another box, one marked documents. My hand stopped. There, resting on top of a stack of old utility bills, was a thick vellum document tied with a faded blue ribbon. It was the original deed to our house, the true deed, the one that named both Dylan and me as equal inheritors upon our mother's death. The document he had nullified with his forged power of attorney. He hadn't even destroyed the primary piece of evidence that proved his fraud. He had simply filed it away. My shock gave way to an ice-cold fury. I pulled out my phone. I switched it to silent, turned off the flash, and began. I photographed everything, page by methodical page. The true deed, credit card statements in my name for cards I never owned, bank applications, invoices from Dylan Monroe Associates, cross-referencing payments from Monroe Financial Solutions. I photographed the boxes, the unit number, the label with his alias. Each picture was a data point, a hard fact, another link in an unbreakable chain of evidence. As I finished, I stood for a moment in the center of the small room, surrounded by the meticulously organized proof of my brother's betrayal. He thought he was untouchable. He believed he was smart enough to build a maze no one could navigate, but he'd underestimated me. He saw a grieving little sister. He'd forgotten about the accountant. I slid the door down, the rattle echoing in the hall. I snapped the padlock shut. The key my mother had left me having done its work. As I walked out into the bright sunshine, I felt no triumph, only a grim, steely resolve. The game he had started was over. My game had just begun. The rage had been a fire, but fires burn out, leaving behind only ash. What replaced it was something far more dangerous, the cold, clean precision of a calculator. Sitting at my mother's dining room table, surrounded by the digital ghosts of my brother's crimes, I understood that a frontal assault would fail. Dylan's life was a fortress of lies, and a direct attack would only be repelled by his well-rehearsed charisma and feigned concern. I couldn't blow a hole in the wall. I had to be invited inside, and then I had to burn the fortress down from within. My plan solidified into a simple three-phase operation. An accountant's strategy for a hostile takeover. Phase 1, record. The paper trail I had was extensive, but a clever lawyer could muddy the waters, could argue coercion or consent. What I lacked was intent. I needed to capture the sound of his arrogance, the texture of his deceit. I needed his own words to become his cage. Phase 2, trap. I had to lure him onto my territory, a place where he felt secure and in control, a place where his guard would be down. I needed to create a scenario that played to his weaknesses, his greed, his arrogance, and his deep-seated need to manage his confused little sister. Phase 3, expose. Once the trap was sprung and the confession was recorded, the paper trail would become the final, irrefutable evidence. The exposure would not be a quiet legal affair. It would be a detonation designed to obliterate his reputation, his career, and the entire false edifice of his life. I spent the next day preparing the battlefield. The living room, with its ghosts and memories, would be the stage. I rehearsed my lines, practicing the right notes of anxiety and confusion, purging my voice of the icy fury that simmered beneath. I set up my props, placing a framed photo of our mother in a prominent position on the mantelpiece. Her gentle smile, a silent judge. Every detail was curated for maximum psychological impact. This would not be a confrontation between siblings. It would be a meticulously planned audit of a man's soul, and I would be the one holding the ledger. At 4 o'clock, when I knew he would be wrapping up at his office, I made the call. I took a deep, steadying breath, picturing the worried, helpless sister I needed to be, and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and professional. Dylan Monroe. Dylan, it's Claire. I pitched my voice to sound shaky, on the verge of tears. I'm sorry to bother you at work, but... Oh, God. I don't know what to do. His tone shifted instantly, dripping with the syrupy, patronizing concern he was so good at faking. Claire, what's wrong? Are you okay? I was going through some of Mom's papers from the lawyer, I said, letting a sob catch in my throat. And I think there's a mistake in the will. It's all so confusing. All this legal language about liabilities and the estate. I don't understand it. Could you please come over? I really need you to explain it to me. The bait was perfect. The will, the estate, it was his territory. The idea that I was questioning it, that I was confused, would be irresistible to him. It was a problem he needed to manage, a loose thread he needed to secure. Of course, Claire, he said, his voice a soothing balm of absolute control. Don't you worry about a thing. I'm leaving the office now. I'll be right there. We'll sort it all out. He was walking into the trap, and he was smiling. 20 minutes later, his truck crunched on the gravel driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird beating against a cage. I took my phone, opened the voice recorder app, and hit the red button. I placed the phone screen down on the coffee table, nestled beside a small stack of our mother's old utility bills. It looked innocuous, just another piece of forgotten clutter. I sat down in the armchair opposite the sofa, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a bomb. He came in without knocking, using his own key. He was the picture of the concerned older brother. His brow furrowed, his expensive coat draped over his arm. "Claire," he said, his voice soft with faux sympathy as he set his briefcase down. "You look terrible. You've been worrying yourself sick over this." He crossed the room and placed a hand on my shoulder, a heavy, proprietary gesture. "I told you I'd handle all this paperwork. I just want to protect you from the ugly stuff." "I know," I said, looking up at him, my expression a carefully crafted mask of distress. "I'm sorry. I just started reading and my head started spinning." "It's okay," he soothed, sitting on the sofa, radiating an aura of calm authority. "Show me what's bothering you." I pushed a random document from the pile toward him, an old property tax assessment. It was meaningless, a piece of misdirection. "This part," I said, pointing to a line of legalese about the estate's liabilities, "what does that mean?" He launched into a patient, condescending explanation. He was in his element now, the financial expert demystifying the complex world of finance for the layman. He spoke of debts and assets, of probate and executors. I let him talk for 5 full minutes, nodding along, my eyes wide with manufactured confusion. He was relaxed. He was in control. He thought he was winning. When he finished his lecture, I let the silence hang for a moment before I made my move. I looked down at my hands. "And there are these other things," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "These bank notices, they keep coming to the house. Dylan, addressed to me for 4 debts. There's a really big one." I looked up, meeting his eyes, letting him see the fear I was projecting. "I'm so scared. I don't know where it came from." "Did you? When you were handling things for Mom, did you have to sign something for me to manage the estate? Using my name?" I watched him carefully. There was no flicker of panic, no sign of guilt. He was too good for that. Instead, he sighed. A deep, theatrical sound of profound disappointment. He leaned back on the sofa and steepled his fingers. "Claire, really?" he said, his voice soft and wounded. "After everything our family has been through, we are going to start suspecting each other now. Mom would be heartbroken to see us like this. She's not even gone a year, and we are at each other's throats. She trusted me to take care of things, to take care of you." It was a masterful performance. He was using our mother's memory as a shield, trying to shame me back into silence and submission, but the woman he was talking to was not the same one from a week ago. "You're right," I said. My voice was suddenly clear and steady. The manufactured tremor was gone. She would be heartbroken. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on his. The air in the room grew thick, charged. "Let's forget about me for a second, Dylan. Let's talk about her. If Mom were alive, sitting right here in her chair, what do you think she would say? What would she think about you using my name to secure a $240,000 loan against her house?" I said the number, the exact number. It was a sniper's bullet, not a shotgun blast. The change was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't a dramatic gasp or a denial, it was a shutdown. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a flat, cold stillness. The patient, concerned brother evaporated. And for the first time, I saw the predator beneath. He didn't speak. He just stared, his mind racing, recalculating, processing the new, catastrophic data. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked into the void. Each tick a hammer blow against the silence. A car passed by outside, sounding alien and intrusive in the suffocating tension of the room. He was trapped, and he knew it. His practice lies were useless against the hard, cold fact of the number. I let the silence stretch for a full minute, watching the sweat bead on his upper lip. Then I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. I dropped my voice to an intimate whisper, a conspiratorial tone that was more menacing than any shout. "It's okay, Dylan," I murmured. "You don't have to lie anymore. It must be exhausting." I paused, letting the words sink in. I found the USB drive. His composure finally, completely shattered. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly grey. A small, involuntary muscle twitched in his jaw. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. It was the sound of a king checkmated, of a fortress breached, of a lie suffocating its creator. And on the table between us, my phone, silent and unassuming, recorded it all, his smooth, condescending lies, his manipulative appeal to our mother's memory, the long, damning silence, and the final, panicked rasp of a guilty man who had just realized the game was lost. The trap had snapped shut. For a moment after I spoke the words, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum pulling all the air, all the sound, all the history between us into a single dense point. I saw a dozen emotions flicker across Dylan's face in a matter of seconds. Shock, disbelief, a flash of pure animal panic. And then, as the cornered predator always does, he chose rage. The carefully constructed dam of his composure didn't just crack, it exploded. "USB," he spat, the words a spray of venom. He shot to his feet, his body thrumming with a violent energy that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. "What the hell are you talking about? Are you insane? I knew this would happen. Grief is making you crazy. Claire, you're inventing conspiracies, seeing ghosts in every shadow. You need help." He began to pace the length of the living room, a caged tiger in his own trap. "How dare you," he seethed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "How dare you sit there in our mother's house and accuse me of what? I was the one here for her every single day. Where were you, Claire? You were at your tidy little job in your tidy little condo, living your tidy little life. I was the one taking her to chemotherapy. I was the one who held the basin when she was sick. I was the one who managed her medication, who talked to the doctors, who held her goddamn hand while she was dying. So don't you dare. Don't you ever dare accuse me of anything." He stopped in front of the fireplace, his chest heaving. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. He gestured wildly at the room around us. "This house. Mom wanted me to have it. She left it to me because I earned it. I was the one who took care of her." The fury of his outburst washed over me, but I remained perfectly still in my armchair. His rage was a storm, but I was the calm at its center. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke, my voice quiet, but cutting through his tirade like a shard of glass. "No, Dylan," I said softly. "She didn't leave you the house because you took care of her. She left you the house because you threatened her." The accusation, spoken so plainly, so devoid of the emotion he was weaponizing, seemed to strike him physically. He recoiled as if I had slapped him. "That is a disgusting, despicable lie," he snarled, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You know nothing. You have no idea what it took to manage her last year. The bills were piling up. The insurance was a nightmare. The stress of it all. You can't possibly understand the kind of pressure I was under, the decisions I had to make." He was trying to reframe his crime as a burden, himself as the victim of circumstance. "You live in a fantasy world, Claire," he sneered, his tone dripping with the old, familiar condescension, "a world of black and white, of neat little columns that always add up. But the real world, the world where people have families to support, a reputation to maintain, businesses to run, it's not clean. It's grey. It's messy. You don't understand anything." "Oh, I understand more than you think," I said. And for the first time, I rose from my chair, a slow, deliberate movement. I felt a strange sense of power, of clarity. I understand more than you can possibly imagine. I understand spreadsheets, Dylan. I understand wire transfers to offshore accounts. I understand the incorporation documents for a shell company called Monroe Financial Solutions. I understand forged signatures on a loan application and a coerced signature on a power of attorney. And I understand with perfect, brutal clarity that you were drowning in debt, and you used our dying mother and your own sister as a human shield to save yourself. I took a step toward him, my voice as cold and hard as the evidence I had collected. You didn't just make a messy decision in a gray area. You committed fraud. You systematically dismantled our family security and our mother's peace of mind to cover your own failures. So don't you dare stand there in her house and tell me what I don't understand. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The barrage of specific factual details had silenced him. His blustering anger was useless against the cold, hard language of his crimes. As he stood there, momentarily stunned, I turned and walked to the small end table where my laptop was waiting. I had placed it there an hour ago, another piece of the stage. I opened the lid. The screen flared to life. His eyes followed my every movement. A dawning horror replacing the anger. He knew, with a sick certainty, what was coming next. I navigated to the desktop, my finger steady on the trackpad. I found the file named For Claire MP3. I didn't look at him. I didn't say a word. I just double-clicked it. And then our mother's voice filled the room. It was weak, ghostly, punctuated by the faint, rhythmic beep of the hospital monitor. Claire. Oh, my sweet girl. If you're listening to this, it means I'm gone. And it means your brother, it means Dylan, has done what I was so afraid of. Dylan flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked wildly from the laptop to the smiling photograph of our mother on the mantelpiece, as if the ghost had materialized beside him. He was trapped between the image of the woman he had pretended to love and the sound of the woman he had terrorized. I let it play. I let her voice detail the forged power of attorney, the theft of the house, the loan he took out in my name. I watched him as he listened. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of ash. His hands began to tremble when the recording reached the part about his threat, her voice cracking as she recounted his words. He finally snapped. He told me that if I said a word, he would have me committed. No, he screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure desperation. He lunged forward, a clumsy, frantic movement, his hands reaching not for me, but for the laptop, for the small silver USB drive I had plugged into its side. It was a primal, instinctual act to physically silence the truth, to stop the voice from the grave from speaking another word. But I was ready. I snatched the USB drive from the port a split second before his fingers could close around it. I closed my fist around the small, hard object, holding it tight. It's too late, Dylan, I said, my voice ringing with a finality that echoed in the silent room. It's backed up on the cloud, on an external drive, in a safe deposit box. Her voice isn't going away, ever. The fight drained out of him in a single, visible rush. The rage, the denial, the arrogant indignation, it all collapsed, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic, trembling ruin of a man. His shoulders slumped. His entire body seemed to shrink. He had no more moves to make, no more lies to tell. He had been completely and utterly exposed. I stood there holding the USB drive like a scepter of judgment. I have a draft email ready to go, I said, my voice as cold and methodical as a death sentence. It's addressed to Michael Vance, your CEO. It's also CC'd to the entire board of directors and the head of your firm's compliance department. The subject line is Urgent Internal Fraud and Embezzlement Investigation. That email contains this audio file. It contains the scans of the forged deed, the fraudulent loan documents, the wire transfer receipts to your shell company, and a very detailed spreadsheet I prepared that outlines your crimes, time-stamped and cross-referenced. If you tell me one more lie, if you try to deny or deflect even one more time, I press send. He stared at the USB in my hand, as if it were a loaded gun pointed at his head. The threat wasn't about jail time. Not yet. It was about something far worse to him, the utter destruction of his identity. The end of Dylan Monroe, the golden boy, the financial wizard, the perfect husband and father. It was the one blow he could not withstand. He made a choking sound and sank onto the sofa, his body folding in on itself. He buried his face in his hands, and a dry, racking sob tore through him. He was no longer a predator, he was just a man, stripped of all his power, weeping amongst the ruins of his life. After a long moment, he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a terror I had never seen before. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice broken. "Claire, what do you want?" I looked down at the pathetic figure of my brother, and I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, no lingering shred of familial affection. Only the cold, clean satisfaction of a debt being called in. "The truth," I said, my voice unwavering, "a full written confession detailing everything you did, signed and notarized. And I want everything our mother left behind, the house, signed back over to me, free and clear, and the $240,000, every last cent, paid back." He stared at me, his mind clearly struggling to process the magnitude of my demands, a full confession, financial ruin. It was a life sentence of a different kind. He opened his mouth, perhaps to bargain, perhaps to beg. But I wasn't finished. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a verdict. I held his gaze, took out my own phone, and unlocked the screen. I opened my email app and navigated to the drafts folder. His eyes widened in absolute panic, as he saw me tap the email to his CEO. "Claire, wait," he pleaded, scrambling to his feet. I didn't wait. I looked him straight in the eye, my thumb hovering over the screen. "This is for Mom," I said, and I pressed send. The 2 days that followed my pressing send were the quietest, most excruciatingly loud days of my life. I did nothing. I waited. I stayed in the house, the scene of the crime, and listened to the silence, knowing it was the deep indrawn breath before a hurricane. The digital bomb I had launched was on a timer, its payload of truth traveling silently through the ether to the inboxes of the most powerful people in my brother's world. I didn't have to wait long. The first tremor was not a phone call, but a bland, automated news alert from a financial journal I followed. The headline was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. Harding Finch places senior manager on administrative leave pending internal review. There was no name, of course. There never is at first, but I knew. The review, they stated, was prompted by a serious allegation of professional misconduct. I imagined the pandemonium behind that sterile press release, the emergency board meetings, the hushed conversations in glass-walled offices, the frantic calls to their legal department. The real damage, however, was happening on a much smaller, more intimate scale. I could picture it perfectly, the anonymous email landing in the inbox of some junior associate, the subject line, urgent internal fraud, too tempting to ignore. The click, the sound of my mother's weak, trembling voice filling a pair of earbuds in an open-plan office, the associate's eyes widening in shock, and then the inevitable forward sent through the company's internal messaging system with a single, explosive acronym, OMG. From there, it would have spread like a contagion. My mother's story, her pain, her final testimony would have become the day's most salacious gossip. All those years my brother had spent cultivating his flawless reputation, all those power lunches and firm handshakes and rounds of golf, all of it incinerated in a matter of hours by a single 3-megabyte audio file. His carefully constructed image was undone not by a rival or a regulator, but by the ghost of the mother he'd betrayed. The irony was so bitter, it was almost sweet. The official news of his suspension came via a text from a former colleague who now worked at Harding Finch. It was simple and discreet. The Dylan situation is nuclear. Everyone's talking. Hope you're okay. He had been officially erased. The next blast crater appeared in the public square. I was scrolling through my phone when the headline from the Pennsylvania Herald's website seemed to leap off the screen. Local financial advisor under investigation for fraud. And there he was. The article itself was thin on confirmed details, citing only anonymous sources within the firm and allegations of financial impropriety. But the photograph they used was his official corporate headshot. It was a picture of Dylan at his peak, his hair perfect, his smile radiating confidence and trustworthiness, his eyes crinkling just so at the corners. He looked like a man who could safeguard your entire future. He looked like a man who could never lie. The public's response was immediate and brutal. The comment section below the article was a cesspool of digital schadenfreude. Always knew he was too good to be true, one wrote. I bet his perfect wife is thrilled, posted another. Thoughts and prayers for his poor family, someone offered, the sentiment dripping with glee. In the town where he had been a minor king, he was now a public spectacle. And then the family war began. My phone, which had been silent for 2 days, began to ring incessantly. It was my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, all calling from the fog of confusion and disbelief. The first wave of calls was exploratory. Claire, honey, what is this nonsense in the paper? We saw the article. This must be some terrible mistake. I knew Dylan would be frantically spinning his own narrative, and I was right. By the afternoon, his version of the story had clearly taken root. He had painted himself as the victim of his unstable, grieving sister, who was trying to steal their mother's inheritance. The tone of the call shifted from confusion to accusation. Claire, I have never been so ashamed in my entire life, she shrieked down the line, her voice trembling with self-righteous fury. How could you do this to your own brother, to your family? After he worked so hard to take care of your mother. You're airing our dirty laundry for the entire world to see. You are a traitor to this family. Your mother would be turning in her grave. I listened to her tirade without interruption. The woman who had once baked me birthday cakes was now calling me a monster. When she finally paused for breath, I replied, my voice a flat, calm monotone. You should wait until all the facts come out, Aunt Carol. Then I hung up. I did the same with every other call. My refusal to engage, to cry or scream or defend myself, was interpreted as the cold-heartedness of a guilty woman. For 72 hours, in the eyes of the family that was supposed to love me, I was the villain. The tide turned not with an emotional appeal, but with the cold, irrefutable power of institutional process. Harding Finch's internal investigation, coupled with the information I'd provided, triggered a formal fraud inquiry at Keystone Mutual Bank. They, in turn, brought in a forensic document examiner, and a week later, I received a crisp, formal letter in the mail. It stated that based on the examiner's expert opinion, the signature on the loan agreement for $240,000 was a forgery, with a statistical certainty of 99.8%. A forgery. The letter was my vindication. It was a dry legal document full of jargon and clauses, but to me, it was a declaration of truth. It concluded by stating that the loan agreement was null and void, effective immediately. The debt was gone. My name was clear. The next call was from my lawyer. Dylan, facing an imminent indictment and acting on the frantic advice of his own legal counsel, had capitulated on all fronts. He had signed the deed transfer. There was no fight, no negotiation, just a quiet, humiliating surrender. The house was mine. News of the confirmed forgery, and the return of the house spread through the family network even faster than the gossip had. The narrative once again did a complete 180. The angry, accusatory phone calls were replaced by awkward, stumbling ones. It was Aunt Carol who called first. "Oh, Claire, honey," she began, her voice thick with a cloying, insincere sympathy. We just heard about the bank. I am so sorry. We had no idea. It's just so shocking. Your poor brother. He must be very unwell to have done something like that. You poor thing, having to go through all that alone. I accepted her apology, with the same detached calm, with which I had accepted her condemnation. "Thank you, Aunt Carol," I said, and nothing more. My composure, once a sign of my villainy, was now recast as dignified, stoic strength. The final domino fell on a grey Tuesday afternoon. The district attorney's office issued a press release. Dylan Monroe had been formally indicted on multiple felony charges, grand larceny in the second degree, identity theft, and 3 counts of wire fraud. It was all there in black and white for the world to see. I had won. By every conceivable metric, I had achieved a total victory. I stood in the living room of what was now officially my house. I held the deed in one hand and the letter from the bank in the other. They were my trophies, proof of my triumph. But as I looked around the silent room at the armchair where my mother used to sit, I felt no joy. There was no triumphant surge of adrenaline, no satisfying sense of peace. I didn't feel happy. I didn't cry. I just felt hollow. An immense, echoing emptiness had taken the place of the rage and the grief. I had exposed the truth. I had reclaimed what was mine. I had brought the man who had hurt my mother to justice. But in the process, I had been forced to detonate my own family, to incinerate the last vestiges of the life I had known. And I was left standing alone in the sober, sterile aftermath. Because I had learned the final, bitter lesson of my crusade, revenge doesn't make you free. It just makes you sober. A month passed. The hurricane had moved on, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage that was not my problem to clean up. My life, in contrast, settled into a new, strange kind of quiet. I lived in my mother's house now, a house that had been scrubbed clean of my brother's fraudulent claim. The legal documents were all signed, the accounts all settled, the world had moved on. The world had moved on. Our extended family, after their brief, awkward flurry of apologies, had retreated into a pained silence, unsure of how to speak to the woman who had surgically removed a part of their family tree. I spent my days sorting through my mother's belongings, but this time, it was different. There was no fear, no suspicion. It was a slow, meditative process of rediscovery. I found her old gardening journals, her favorite novels with passages underlined, a box of letters she had exchanged with my father before they were married. I was not excavating a crime scene anymore. I was communing with a memory. The emptiness I had felt in the immediate aftermath of the fallout had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was less of an aching void and more of a quiet, empty room, waiting to be filled with something new. The sobriety of my victory was a constant state. I saw everything and everyone with a stark, unforgiving clarity. Then, one Tuesday evening, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, and my breath caught. It wasn't a name, but a sterile institutional label, PA County Detention Center. A cold, automated voice spoke when I answered, its tone as flat and gray as the prison walls. This is a collect call from an inmate at the Pennsylvania County Detention Facility. To accept the charges, press 1. My hand trembled as I pressed the button. A part of me wanted to hang up, to sever this final toxic connection, but I knew I couldn't. This was the last entry on the ledger, the final account that needed to be closed. After a moment of static and the distant, chaotic clang of metal on metal, his voice came on the line. It was a voice I almost didn't recognize. The confidence, the smooth baritone authority, the condescending warmth, it was all gone. All that was left was a thin, hollowed-out whisper, stripped of everything but exhaustion and defeat. "Claire," he said. "I'm here," I replied, my own voice a cool, steady monotone. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the static of the prison phone line. He was waiting for me to say something, to scream or cry or accuse. I did none of those things. I just waited. The silence was my territory now. Finally, he spoke again. The words a clumsy, broken rush. I'm sorry, he stammered. "Claire, I am so sorry. I never wanted. I was just so scared. So scared of losing everything." The apology, when it finally came, was exactly what I expected. It was not for me or for our mother, it was for himself. An excuse wrapped in the guise of a confession. It was about his fear, his potential loss. The selfishness that had driven his crimes was still the only engine he had. "You already have," I said, the words falling like ice chips into the silence. There was no satisfaction in saying it. It was simply a statement of fact, an auditor's final summary. I thought of everything the word encompassed: his job, his reputation, the trust of his wife and children, his perfect house in the suburbs, now with a for sale sign out front to cover his legal fees, his name, once a symbol of success in our small town, now a synonym for fraud. His freedom. He seemed to understand. He didn't argue. He just let out a long, shuddering breath. "I know," he whispered. "God, I know." He was quiet for a moment. And when he spoke again, his voice was thick with a resentful, self-pitying truth. "I knew Mom was going to leave everything to you. She always did. I saw the way she looked at you. I was the one who was successful, the one who did everything right. But you were always the one she loved more. I just wanted a chance, a real chance to have something that was mine, something she couldn't give to you instead." And there it was. The rotten, festering core of it all. It wasn't just about debt or business failures, it was about us. It was about a lifetime of perceived slights, of a sibling rivalry that had festered in his soul and turned malignant. He, the golden boy, had seen himself as the underdog in our mother's heart. His entire life had been a frantic performance to win an imaginary competition. And when he felt he was losing, he decided to burn down the entire stage. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a profound and sorrowful understanding of just how broken he was. I had spent my life thinking I had a brother, but I had only ever known the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. "You had a chance, Dylan," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "You had 35 years of chances. You had a chance to be a good son when Mom was sick. You had a chance to be an honest man when you got into trouble. You had a chance to be a brother and ask for help. That was your chance, the real one, and you threw it away." My words were a final judgment, and there was nothing he could say to refute them. The line went quiet again, the silence deeper this time. I could hear the faint, hollow echo of the room he was in. The sound of a life reduced to a concrete box. I was about to hang up, to end it for good, when he spoke one last time, his voice small and pleading, a pathetic attempt to grasp at a shared memory, a history he had forfeited. "I still have it," he said. "You know," he said, "that picture from when we were kids, the one of Mom holding you at the park with the scraped knee. I kept it in my wallet. I pictured it instantly, a sun-drenched afternoon. I was 5, beaming with a gap-toothed smile despite the fresh wound on my knee. My mother was laughing, her arms wrapped around me, her face the very definition of love. And Dylan, a serious 10-year-old boy in a striped polo shirt, stood just to the side, not quite in the circle of her arms, his expression unreadable, watching. It was a desperate, pathetic plea, An attempt to remind me that we were once a family, that there was a time before the lies. He was trying to leverage a memory he no longer had any right to. "Keep it," I said, and my voice was cold and final, like a steel door slamming shut. "It's the only thing you didn't steal." I pressed the end call button before he could reply. The digital chirp of the disconnection was sharp and absolute. The silence that rushed back into the room was total. I stood there for a long moment, the receiver still warm in my hand. My eyes were drawn to the wall above the fireplace. There, in a tarnished silver frame, was the original photograph, the real one. I walked over to it, my feet silent on the old wooden floor. I looked at the image, the happy little girl, the laughing mother, and the watchful, serious boy who would one day become a monster. I saw the entire story, from its innocent beginning to its tragic, inevitable end. In that moment, I finally understood the true nature of my victory. It wasn't the day the newspaper headline ran. It wasn't the moment the lawyers confirmed the house was mine. It wasn't even the satisfying click of the send button. Those were just the noisy mechanics of retribution. The real victory was this. This quiet room, this profound, unbroken silence. The fight was over. The debt had been paid. The final account was closed. I realized then that revenge doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need the applause of vindicated allies or the gasps of a shocked public. All it truly needs is the silence that follows when the war is finally truly over. The trial was a formality. My written confession, the audio recordings, the mountain of financial documents, it was an open and shut case. The local paper, which had followed the saga with a lurid fascination, ran its final definitive headline on the day of the sentencing. I saw it on a newsstand while buying coffee. The bold black letters, a stark epitaph for a life that was now over, whistleblower accountant exposes brother's fraud. Dylan Monroe sentenced to 7 to 10 years. The article used a new picture of him, a grim, candid shot taken outside the courthouse. The confident mask was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out expression of a man who had lost everything and knew it. There was also a small, grainy photo of me, taken from a distance as I left the courthouse, my face obscured by my hair. The caption called me the elusive sister. In the days that followed, my email inbox and voicemail became a war zone. I was no longer the villain or the victim, I was a hot commodity. Local news affiliates, true crime podcasts, even a producer for a national morning show, they all wanted a piece of the story. They wanted to put a face to the whistleblower accountant. They wanted to hear the salacious details, the emotional agony, the triumphant conclusion. They wanted to package my pain into a neat 3-act narrative for public consumption. I deleted every email without reading past the subject line. I let every call from an unknown number go to voicemail, the messages piling up, a chorus of unheard requests. I had not done this for them. My victory was not a public performance. The truth I had fought for was a private, sacred thing, and I would not offer it up to be picked over by strangers. My work was not in a television studio, it was here within the 4 walls of my mother's house. Now that the legal battles were over and the noise of the world had faded, the real work could begin. The house was mine, yes, but it still felt like a crime scene. Every room was haunted, not by my mother's ghost, but by the lingering residue of Dylan's deceit. The air was thick with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. It needed to be cleansed, not with sage or incense, but with order. So, I began to clean. I started in the attic and worked my way down, a methodical top-to-bottom restoration. It was a slow, deliberate process. I touched every object, every piece of my mother's life that my brother had tried to either hide or erase. I emptied boxes that hadn't been opened in decades, the scent of dust and time rising up to meet me. I found my own forgotten childhood finger paintings with clumsy, oversized suns. Report cards with my mother's proud signature. A collection of seashells from a family vacation we'd taken when I was 7. Each one wrapped carefully in tissue paper. These were the things Dylan had dismissed as junk, the memories he had labeled as trash. I unwrapped each one like a precious jewel. I washed the china that hadn't been used since our last Christmas together. I polished the silver until it gleamed. I dusted every book on every shelf, running my fingers over the faded spines of the novels my mother had loved. With each small act of care, I felt like I was pushing back against the violation, reclaiming the space inch by inch. This was not just cleaning, it was a ritual. I was restoring not just a house, but a legacy. I was putting my mother's life back in its proper order, honoring the details he had tried to discard. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in the small guest room my mother had used as her sewing room. The air smelled of thread, machine oil, and lavender. Her old Singer sewing machine sat on a sturdy wooden table, a half-finished quilting project still tucked under the needle, a silent testament to a life interrupted. I ran my hand over the cool black metal of the machine. It was a formidable, solid object, a relic from an era when things were built to last. I sat in her chair, my feet on the worn treadle pedal, and for a reason I couldn't explain, I opened the small built-in drawer on the side, the one where she kept her spare bobbins and needles. It was mostly empty, save for a few stray pins and a small, folded piece of notepaper, yellowed with age. It was not a receipt, or a pattern note. My heart gave a little jolt. I unfolded it carefully. The creases were stiff and deep. It was my mother's handwriting from years ago, when her hand was still strong and steady. The note was not for the world. It was not even for me, not explicitly. It felt like a note to herself, a mantra, a piece of her own core philosophy. There were only 7 words written in elegant, looping cursive: Claire, live by your own honesty. I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a warning or a piece of advice, it was a directive. It was the very essence of the woman who had raised me, the principle she had embodied every day of her life. And it was the principle I had, without realizing it, used as my compass through the darkest days of my own. She had been honest to a fault, and my brother had seen that as a weakness to be exploited. But it wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. It was the one weapon he could never possess, and could never defeat. Tears. I didn't know I still had pricks at the corners of my eyes. These were not tears of grief or anger, they were tears of recognition, of connection. It felt as though she had reached across the veil of death, and placed her hand on my shoulder, affirming everything I had done. This small, forgotten piece of paper was more valuable than the deed to the house, more validating than any court verdict. I folded the note back along its original creases, and took it downstairs. I found an old, simple silver frame that had once held a picture of a distant cousin. I removed the photograph and carefully placed my mother's note inside. Centering the 7 words behind the glass, I hung it on the wall in the entryway. The first thing I would see when I left and the last thing I would see when I returned. It was my new declaration of independence, my personal constitution. As I stepped back to look at it, a break in the afternoon clouds sent a shaft of brilliant sunlight pouring through the living room window. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, and fell across the pale yellow curtains, the very curtains my mother had sat at this machine and sewn 20 years ago. The light warmed the room, chasing the shadows from the corners. It was a benediction. I stood in the center of the room, in the warm pool of light, and I whispered the words to the silence, to the house, to the memory of my mother. I did the right thing. And in that moment, a profound sense of peace settled over me, a peace that had been absent for so long I had forgotten what it felt like. For the first time since my mother's death, the house was not a place of sorrow or conflict, it was simply home. The oppressive weight of Dylan's warning, the phrase that had been the catalyst for this entire nightmare, "Don't touch her stuff," was finally, completely gone. It no longer held any power. It had been a command born of lies, a shield for his secrets. But now the secrets were gone. The truth was out, and the house and everything in it was no longer his to control, or mine to conquer. It belonged to the truth. It belonged to her memory, and I was no longer its prisoner, but its keeper. The house was empty. It had taken weeks, but I had finally cleared it out, room by painstaking room. I had donated the furniture, packed away the keepsakes, and hired a crew to give the walls a fresh coat of neutral white paint. It was no longer my mother's house, filled with the ghosts of a life that was lived. It was not yet my house, a place I could imagine a future in. It was a space in between, a clean, silent vessel, hollowed out and waiting. The floors were bare, amplifying every small sound into an echo. The scent of old memories had been replaced by the sterile, optimistic smell of fresh paint. It was a blank page. I stood in the center of the cavernous, empty living room. Night had fallen, and the only light came from the fireplace, where a low, steady fire I'd built an hour ago pulsed with a warm orange glow. On the floor in front of me sat my open laptop, its screen a cold blue rectangle in the dimness, and next to it, resting on the polished hardwood, was the small silver USB drive, the beginning and the end of it all. This was the last ritual, the final closing of the account. I knelt on the floor, the fire warming my face. I didn't need to play the recording again. I knew every word, every pained breath, every beat of the hospital monitor in the background by heart. It was etched into my memory. But I looked at the screen, at the file list inside the folder named mortgage. All the cold, hard facts of my brother's betrayal, listed in neat digital lines. Through the large, curtainless window, the distant glow of a single street light cast a long, lonely reflection across the laptop screen, bisecting the list of files like a scar. It was the only light in the world outside, a solitary witness. For so long, my life had been defined by a simple binary code, before the discovery, and after. Before, I was a woman who lived by the predictable certainties of a spreadsheet, a sister who believed in the simple, uncomplicated narrative of her family. After, I became an archaeologist of lies, a warrior fighting a war no one else could see. My brother had built his entire identity on a foundation of secrets, and his greatest fear was having them exposed. He thought that by hiding the truth, he could control reality. He tried to bury our mother's memory, to erase her story and rewrite it with his own. But he had made a fatal error. He never understood that the truth isn't a document you can shred, or a memory you can discard, it's a living thing. It has weight, and it will always eventually find its way to the surface. In his desperate attempt to hide his lies, he had forced me to go digging. And in the dark, dusty corners of my mother's life where he had hidden his crimes, I had found more than just proof. I found the truth of her strength, a quiet resilience I had always taken for granted. I found the truth of his weakness, a pathetic, festering jealousy that had poisoned him from the inside out. And in the end, I had found the truth about myself. I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. I learned that the methodical, logical mind of an accountant could be a formidable weapon. I learned that I was not the compliant, passive little sister he had always treated me as. I was my mother's daughter, and I would not stand by while her memory was desecrated. He wanted to hide everything, but the light I had been forced to shine into his darkness had illuminated myself. I looked from the screen to the dancing flames in the hearth. I thought of my mother's voice, a ghost in the machine. I leaned closer to the laptop and whispered the words into the empty room, a final reply to her last desperate message, "He hid lies, Mom." With a soft click, I closed the laptop's lid, plunging the room into a deeper darkness, leaving only the warm, flickering light of the fire. The reflection of the street light was gone. The case was closed. I picked up the USB drive. It felt small and insignificant in my hand, a tiny piece of plastic and metal that had held the power to detonate a life. It had been my sword and my shield. It had been the key that unlocked everything. But its purpose was served. The evidence was no longer needed. The truth was now a part of me. I walked to the hearth. The warmth of the fire, a stark contrast to the cold metal in my hand. I opened the glass door, and a wave of heat washed over my face, smelling of oak and ash. I looked down at the small drive one last time. I saw not just a piece of technology, but a symbol of all the pain, all the fear, all the anger. It was the vessel that had held the poison, and it was time to let it go. I didn't hesitate. I tossed it into the heart of the fire. For a moment, nothing happened. It sat there on the glowing embers, an alien object in the flames. Then the plastic casing began to blister and curl at the edges. A thin wisp of acrid, black smoke rose from it. The plastic melted away, revealing the delicate circuitry within. The metal of the connector glowed a dull, angry red, then brighter until it was the same incandescent orange as the coals it rested upon. It held its shape for a few seconds longer, a final stubborn ghost of its form, and then it sagged, warped, and was consumed. A small shower of sparks, like tiny, fleeting stars, rose up the chimney. A puff of grey ash drifted out into the room, dissolving into the air, carrying the last remnants of the battle with it. It mixed with the familiar, comforting smell of burning wood. All the evidence had served its purpose. All the hatred had been spent. I closed the fireplace door, its latch clicking shut with a soft finality. I turned my back on the flames, on the last embers of my revenge, and walked through the echoing, empty rooms. My footsteps were the only sound, a steady, rhythmic beat in the profound silence. I reached the front door, turned the knob, and stepped out onto the porch into the cool night air. As if on cue, a drop of rain hit my hand. Then another. A soft, steady rain began to fall, whispering on the roof, tapping on the leaves of the old oak tree in the yard. It was not a violent, angry storm. It was a gentle, cleansing rain. The air grew heavy with the clean, earthy scent of petrica, the smell of the earth drinking in the water. I stood there on the porch, under the safety of the eaves, and watched it fall. It washed the dust from the street, slicked the pavement into a dark, reflective mirror, and nourished the thirsty ground. The house behind me was silent. The world before me was silent, save for the soothing, rhythmic patter of the rain, and I felt no fear. The silence I had once dreaded. The silence that had represented grief and loneliness, and suspense was now a comfort. It was not an absence of sound. It was the presence of peace. It was the sound of a future waiting to be written. It was the sound of my own life beginning now. And for the first time, I was no longer afraid of it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me to be able to share it with you all. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Share your thoughts, your feelings, anything the story brought up for you. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support this work, please hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support makes all of this possible.